Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I have fond memories of this conference. I spoke at a Tibco conference years ago in Florida, and I had a chance conversation with Vivek, and out of that conversation came he told me about his daughter's basketball team, and out of that conversation came the inspiration for my last book, David and Goliath. So I basically owe Tibco a huge amount in royalties. This was actually a long time ago, though, when before Vivek had bought the Sacramento Kings, when he actually was an underdog before he became the man. So I thought today I would pick up on this theme of that Vivek was talking about civilization 3.0. We're in the middle of this moment of extraordinary transformation, transformation driven by technology, and that's obviously what you're going to be talking about over the next couple of days, about how to harness this technology in ways to transform the world and business that we operate in. But I wanted to take a step backwards before you get into that, immerse yourself in the world of technology, and talk about the kinds of psychological preconditions, the kinds of attitudes that make effective use of technology possible. Because I think there's more to transformation simply than having the tools and the skills and the resources to bring about a change. There has to be some kind of fundamental attitude that lies behind an approach to new technology. And to talk about it, to shed light on what I think that those attitudes are, I wanted to tell you a story about someone who transformed his world about as much as almost anyone else in the 20th century. And it's a very remarkable man by the name of Malcolm McLean. Malcolm McLean was born in 1913 in southeastern North Carolina, swamp country, a town called Maxton. And he grows up in the Depression. His dad is a farmer, and he never graduates from high school. And he gets a job right after he drops out of high school working for a gas station. And he learns that the boss of the gas station is paying someone $5 a week to truck fuel oil in from Fayetteville, North Carolina, which is about 25 miles away. And he goes to his boss and says, can I do that? I'd love to take that over. And the guy says, sure. And so he finds some rusty truck that's in the back of the gas station, and he refurbishes it, and he takes over that route. And by the end of the year, he's got 2 trucks and someone working for him. And by the time the Second World War starts, he has 172 trucks. And by the time the 1950s rolls around, he's got 1,700 trucks and the second biggest, I think, or third biggest trucking company in the United States. He's this incredible entrepreneur. He's this little, skinny Scottish guy, which means he doesn't really have any emotions, and he's got like a long nose and a bald head. But he's a really incredible innovator. He's the first person to use diesel fuel exclusively in his trucking fleet, to recognize what a cost saving that could be. He's the first person to map out the most efficient routes for his truckers to follow. In other words, to tell his truckers how they ought to get from A to B and realize all of the efficiencies with that. He's this unbelievably competitive guy. He's the kind of guy, if you went hunting with him, he would bet on who killed the first bird, who killed the most birds, who killed the biggest birds. I mean, he's that sort of, I imagine there are many people like that in this room. You'll know the type. Anyway, he's this really extraordinary man. But the most crucial moment in his career comes in 1937, when he's still driving his own trucks. He takes a load of cotton from Fayetteville to the docks in Newark. And when he gets there, he arrives in the morning, he has to wait all day for his truck to be unloaded. And it drives him crazy. Here's this guy who's unbelievably, he's in a hurry, right? He's incredibly restless and impatient. And to be sitting in his truck after he raced all night to get to Newark, waiting for some longshoreman to get around to unload it, just drives him out of his mind. And he says to himself, there has got to be a better way for trucks or for goods to be handled at ports. And what he was talking about, or what he was reflecting on, was a very common problem at that point, not just in the American economy, but around the world. The ports, up until the middle of the last century, were the great choke point of the global economy. They were conducted in the same way that they had been conducted for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You drove up with some freight, or you came in with some freight on on a railway car. It was unloaded piece by piece. Each piece was entered into a ledger and then placed in a warehouse and then loaded one by one into the appropriate ship. The process took forever. If you were moving freight from, say, Newark to London, your freight, it would take as long to load the ship in Newark and unload it in London as it would to sail between Newark and London. If you were moving freight across the ocean, the cost, 50% of the cost of moving that freight was simply in the loading and the unloading at each end. The docks were controlled by organized crime and by unions, sometimes both in combination. Weird little thing that happened in this country for many years. There was incredible theft. They were such a problem, in fact, that many companies in this country and others who would have benefited very meaningfully by trading with countries overseas didn't even bother. It was just too much of a hassle. It wasn't worth trying to move freight overseas unless you were moving a lot or moving something that was extraordinarily valuable. So Maclean thinks about this and broods about this for 20 years until in the mid-1950s, he's finally in a position where he's big enough to do something about it. And so what he does is he goes out and he buys a couple of ships. And he has all these ideas about how he's going to fix the problem. And his first idea is he's just going to drive his tractor trailers onto the ship, unhook the trailer, drive the engine off, and just ship the whole thing. But he quickly realizes that makes no sense. The trailer's really heavy. It takes up a lot of space. And while the trailer's on the ship, he can't use it, right? So he says, no, it'd be better if I made the container on the back of the ship detachable. So I would just drive up to the dock, lift the container off, and then slide the container into the ship, right? So he works out how to do this. He gets a crane to lift the container off, and he designs this special container that can be unlatched from the trailer, and he retrofits this ship called the Ideal X that has little grooves in it. And you can just slide the containers right in. And on April 26, 1956, he loads up the Ideal X in Newark Harbor, and he sails it with a full cargo down the eastern seaboard to the port of Houston. And he gets on after he loads it up, he gets on a plane and he flies down to Houston to beat the ship there. And he stands at the port of Houston until the Ideal X comes up the channel. And when he sees it, he does the math, and he realized that he loaded up that ship in 8 hours when it would normally have taken 3 days. And he had transported his cargo from Newark to Houston for 15 cents a ton when it would normally have cost $5.58 a ton. And he starts to cry. This Scottish guy who has no emotions starts to cry because he realizes that he's changed the world, right? He has done something that has fundamentally altered the world economy. And he's right. You can date the birth of the global economy to April 26, 1956, when Malcolm Maclean figures out containerized shipping, because without containerized shipping, there is nothing that resembles the global economy. There's no South Korea, there's no Japan, there's no China. Everything that we do, in one sense, is dependent on breaking open that bottleneck and at the ports of the developed world. Right? I mean, in this room, if I said to you, what is the most important innovation of the 20th century, I'm sure you would all vote for the transistor, but I would argue to you that a very close second is the container. So the question is, here we have this guy who does in his own world what all of you want to do in your own world, what we're all trying to do in new and different ways today. And the question is, what can we learn from him? What is it that makes it possible for Malcolm Maclean to bring about this epic transformation in the world that he's all about? And the answer is that he has a series of attitudes, of really crucial attitudes that I think are as relevant today to transformation as they were back then. The first thing to understand about Maclean is that as he is entering the shipping business and pushing forward this idea of containers, everyone around him thinks he's crazy. There is almost a universal position that Malcolm Maclean is committing corporate suicide with his move into shipping. The first reason is that people had tried the container idea before. In fact, it had been tried over and over again over the previous 30 years, and absolutely every time it had been tried, it had ended in disaster. The problem, first of all, was the containers are really heavy. They made them out of steel, and you ended up having the container was 30% of the weight of the cargo you were moving, which the economics of that are crazy. They don't make any sense, right? And then when they got to the pier with these incredibly heavy containers, the longshoremen didn't know how to lift them or move them. And then when they tried to pack them in ships, the ships weren't properly retrofitted, and you had all kinds of leftover space, and so the process of moving cargo was incredibly inefficient. And then everybody had a different size container, so it was just mayhem at the docks whenever someone tried to introduce containers to the world of shipping. When the Army actually conducts in the 1940s an experiment to try and figure out the economics of this new technology. And they move a whole bunch of freight from an Army base in Pennsylvania to Labrador in Canada. And they do all the math, and they discover that moving something by container costs 10% more than moving it the traditional way. And that's only if you abandon the container on the beaches of Labrador. If you want to take it back to America, it costs 70% more to move stuff by container. People look at that and they say, this is a non-starter. It's not going anywhere. And then there's the problem that McLean is entering in his 50s, a completely new industry. There is no overlap between trucking and shipping. They're completely different industries with different rules, different unions, different regulations. One is shipping is incredibly capital intensive. Trucking is the opposite. When McLean makes this transition, he sells off his trucking business, and he has to go into a massive amount of debt to be able to make this new venture. So much debt, in fact, that the whole thing just looks preposterous. He goes at one point in the mid-50s to Amsterdam to try and make his case to the international shipping community. And they quite literally laugh him off the stage. People just think this whole thing is lunacy. So what does he do in reaction to this kind of universal ridicule and disdain? Nothing. Didn't care. Care less. It absolutely has zero effect on him that everyone thinks he's insane. The word that we use to describe that kind of person is disagreeable. And I don't mean that as a synonym for obnoxious. Disagreeable is the term that psychologists use to describe people who do not require the approval of their peers to do what they think is correct. So when you look at entrepreneurs as a group and you analyze their personality, what you discover is that entrepreneurs are essentially people with three personality traits in combination. They are, first of all, incredibly open. They are imaginative, right? That makes sense. They have really, really original creative ideas. They are, secondly, conscientious. That is to say, they have the discipline and the focus to bring those ideas to fruition. And right away, by the way, when you look at those two ideas, you realize why it is so rare to find good entrepreneurs. There are lots of people who are imaginative but not conscientious, right? If you doubt that, we can go on a journey down over to the mission, and I can show you lots of people working in coffee shops on screenplays that will never bear the light of day. That is creativity without focus, right? Without conscientiousness, right? Similarly, I can take you to see my accountant, and I will show you discipline and focus without creativity. Thank God, right? By the way, I don't know if I want an accountant who's got a lot of imagination, right? So it's rare to have those two things in common. But then the third thing that entrepreneurs must have is they must be disagreeable, right? It's not enough to have a great idea and the focus and the conscientiousness to see it to fruition. You must have the strength and the resolve and the courage to pursue that idea even when the rest of the world thinks you're insane, right? Time and time again, if you look at the stories of extraordinarily important entrepreneurs, there is almost always a moment when they are the only ones who believe in the value of what they're doing. I tell in my book, David and Goliath, the story of Ingvar Kamprad, the guy who founds IKEA. And the crucial moment in the story of IKEA is when he faces a boycott from the other furniture manufacturers in Sweden, and he's about to go out of business. And in desperation, he moves his operations across the Baltic Sea from Sweden to Poland. and sets up shop in Poland. And that's what IKEA is. IKEA is essentially furniture shipped flat made in Poland. That's the original elevator pitch for IKEA. What's interesting about that is he does it in 1961. At the height of the Cold War, at a time when East and West, communist world and free world are closer to outright war than at any other time in history, a guy living in the West, Sweden, crosses the pond to Poland, the Iron Curtain, and sets up shop. You cannot imagine what a controversial move that was. That would be like Walmart opening operations in North Korea. Literally, it's on that level of kind of eyebrow raising, you've got to be kidding me, who is this guy kind of thing. But he does it, and he persists, and he turns his back on all those critics. Why? Because he is a deeply disagreeable person. Didn't need people to agree with him, right? And that's how he's able to build IKEA into this extraordinary runaway success story. That's very hard to do. As human beings, we are hardwired to want the approval of our peers, right? I remember once in one of my books, I was hanging out with this guy a guy named John Gottman, who would videotape couples and could predict, just by looking at a videotape snippet of couples talking to each other, with almost perfect accuracy whether they would still be together in 1 year's time. And just by reading the emotions on their face. And one of his big points is that if you see contempt on the face of one or either or both of partners in a relationship, that relationship is doomed. Why? Because contempt is the emotion of exclusion. It's the emotion that says, I can't even deal with you anymore. And the minute we see that in our partner, we're finished. We can't deal with that kind of rejection, right? We have to leave, right? That's how deeply the desire to be wanted and to be approved of is part of our DNA. But someone like Conrad or Malcolm McLean has that unique ability to stand up in the face of that kind of ridicule and shrug. They have the courage of their convictions. Second thing, interesting thing about McLean. You know, at the time that McLean is trying to transform the world of shipping, there has been an active effort in every aspect of the shipping business to reform. Everyone is aware that the docks are the true problem choke point in the American economy. And the trucking business is trying to clean up their act and be more efficient, and the shippers have all these ideas about how they can do a better job, and people on the docks trying to bring in new technologies. Forklifts are brought in. There's all kinds of ideas about how can we make this better, and it's not working. It's all of these reforms aren't having any discernible impact on the efficiency of international trade. And then McLean comes along and he says, you know what? You guys aren't doing it right. You're trying to solve one little corner here or one little corner over here. What has to happen is that we have to completely reimagine every single step in the supply chain. So he starts with the companies and says, you've got to fill a container. In other words, you can't just ship little small lots overseas. You've got to give me enough that we can fill one 40,000-pound container. And then he understands the container has to be light, right? Because if it's too heavy, then the economics make no sense. So he redesigns the container. And then he says they have to be standardized. You can't have 10 different shapes and sizes of containers. It doesn't work. And then he realized it's got to unhook from the trailer of the truck really easily. You can't spend 4 hours trying to get it off. And it has to be transferable to a railway car because you don't know what's on the other end. And when you're at the dock, you've got to strengthen the pier because all of a sudden now you're moving a 40,000-pound container on it. And you've got to run a railway line so that the shipping crane can move up and down next to the ship. And the shipping crane's got to be specially designed. And the ship itself has got to be retrofitted perfectly so you don't waste any space. And on and on and on. And he does all those things and he still has a problem and he realizes, oh my goodness, I've got to change the sales force in my shipping company. I can't have the same guys who've been doing it for 50 years. They're not up to speed with the complexity of a world where I'm moving stuff from here to here. So he brings in an entirely new and much more highly qualified and sophisticated sales force. What he's doing is he is reframing the business. People before him thought that they were either in the ship business or in the trucking business or in the rail business or in the dock business. And he comes along, McLean does, and says, you're not in all of those things. The business is moving heavy stuff from A to B. The mode of transportation is irrelevant. We are just in, he reframes what they're doing as moving a heavy box from here to there. Now that sounds like a very trivial thing, but it's not. Because when you look at examples of successful transformation, you will find that they invariably begin with someone having the imagination to rethink the nature of the business that they're in, right? So if you look, for example, a great example is the history of radio. When radio is introduced in this country, it's a flop. It doesn't, there are years and years and years where no one's buying it. And the radio manufacturers are tearing out their hair. They're like, we've invented the single coolest piece of technology in forever. I mean, talk about a game changer. This is the most disruptive thing in the world, and no one will buy it, right? And they can't figure out why. And then along comes a guy named David Sarnoff, who works for RCA, and he says, you know, our problem is that we've framed our proposition all wrong. We're trying to sell people a box, a piece of technology. That's not what they want. He says, and then Sarnoff goes out and he famously broadcasts a boxing match between Jack Dempsey and George Carpentier in New Jersey in 1923. And why does he do it? Because he says, we're not selling boxes, we're selling experiences. We're in the business of bringing the world live into people's living room. And framed that way, all of a sudden, people get it. It's like, oh, I can listen to the boxing match from my living room. That makes sense to me. Reframe that way, radio becomes this runaway success story. Comprad does the same thing, by the way, with IKEA. Before IKEA, people in the furniture business framed what they were doing was, we manufacture business and we sell it to consumers. Comprad said, no, that's way too restrictive. What we do is we make furniture in partnership with consumers and transfer ownership to them, right? That sounds like a trivial thing. It's not. It's the foundation for the biggest retailer, one of the biggest retailers in the world, right? That kind of reframing, though, is hard. Why? Because people who have been doing something a certain way for a long period of time have their identities bound up in that definition of business. The people who ran the shipping business up to the 1950s in the United States were all based in downtown Manhattan in these magnificent skyscrapers, and they were heirs to companies that had been around for hundreds of years, that had hundreds of millions of dollars in inventory, and who would get up, go to their offices and have lunch every day at the Maritime Club. And they saw themselves as the inheritors of a tradition going back thousands of years of captains of ships, of people who mastered the high seas, of all the romance that's associated with that kind of a world, the maritime world. And along comes McLean and says, I care less. That's not what this is about. You're in the business of moving stuff from A to B. And they don't get it, right? They don't have the imagination to reframe that business. And what happens? If you look at a list of the top 5 shipping companies in the United States in 1950 and compare it to a list of the top 5 shipping companies today, it's totally different. They're all gone, right? All these companies with their vast resources and their incredible long histories and their this and that and the other, they all vanished. Not because they weren't smart, not because they weren't experienced, not because they didn't have resources, no, because they lacked the imagination to reframe the business they were in the face of a transformation. Last thing, in the summer of 1956, after it becomes clear that container shipping is for real, the longshoremen up and down the East Coast of the United States go on strike, quite appropriately. He was about to put them all out of business. And they were like, whoa, right? So they went on strike. And it was this one of those extraordinarily bitter, divisive, violent strikes. And McLean, being McLean, says, fantastic. This is just the opportunity I need. I'm going to go back and I'm going to retrofit my ships, because what he really wants to do is he's decided to standardize the container at 35 feet long, which is a bigger container than he used before. So he's like, I'm going to use the period of the strike basically to get up to speed. But he realizes that if he wants to bring in a larger, heavier container, He's going to need new cranes. The existing cranes they have on various docks up and down the East Coast are not strong enough to lift 40,000 pounds. So he's like, where can I get a crane? So he goes to the companies that make cranes for the shipping business and says, I need a new, more powerful crane. And by the way, I need it in 90 days, because I think the strike's going to be over in 90 days. And they look at him like he's insane. Like, first of all, we don't have a crane that's that strong. Secondly, 90 days. I mean, this is a huge piece of heavy equipment. You don't get it in 90 days. I just tried to order a sofa not long ago. You can't get a sofa in this country in 90 days, right? The idea that you get a crane in 90 days is absolutely absurd, right? So what does McLean do? He says, all right, if you can't help me, you can't help me. And then he thinks, well, who else is in the business of lifting heavy stuff in this country? And he realizes, oh, the lumber business. They're constantly bringing logs down and lifting a bunch of logs that must be really heavy. Maybe they have cranes that work. So he goes out to a company called Skagit in Washington State and says, do you have a crane that'll work for me? And they go, yeah. He says, can I have it in 90 days? And they go, yeah. And so he brings in a crane. Now, what's interesting to me about that story is, one is that because he's framed his business as being just moving heavy stuff, he's not limited to going to the shipping crane people, right? He doesn't care, he'll go anywhere. But more importantly, the 90 days is the thing that's fascinating. He's fixated on getting it now, right? And this absurd and seemingly absurd request, they not just build him a huge piece of heavy machinery, but they get it tomorrow and bring it to his docks. Now, why is he so insistent that it happen within 90 days? Right? Because he's in a hurry. Because he is filled with a sense of urgency. And when you look again at these stories of the great entrepreneurs, the people who really transform the worlds they're in, they are always filled with that same sense of urgency. They are people who need to do things right away. And I mention that because this idea of urgency is obviously at the core of the DNA of Tibco, right? This is a company that for years has been talking about the importance of building technology that can let you see data in real time. But that is more than simply a technological capability. Or rather, having the ability to see data in real time is not enough. You have to have a need to see it in real time. You have to want to. You have to be motivated to use data in real time. In other words, the effectiveness of that kind of technology begins with an attitude. And so all of these things that I've been talking about fit that same bill, right? Courage and imagination and urgency are not things that depend on resources. They don't depend on technology. They don't depend on expertise. You don't need a PhD to have them. No, they're states of mind, right? Transformation begins with an attitude, a way of looking at the world. It begins with the guy who sits in his truck at the port of Newark and says, why is no one unloading my truck? Right? Begins with an attitude. Thank you.